Hello and welcome to this installment of Vox Machina. As your narrator, I'll be bringing fantastic works of fiction from the page to your eardrums. Uploads will be posted weekly, so be sure to subscribe and hit the alerts bell to be notified when new installments are available. Got a story you think deserves the Vox Machina treatment? Let me know in a comment and you might just hear it in a future episode. Thanks for listening and on with the show. How to Train Your Malfoy by Fencer X. Episode 1. Harry Potter and Hermione Granger had been friends for nearly 11 years now, and in all that time he'd been asked by her to keep a secret just 3 times. Once when she'd confessed to kissing Luna Lovegood on really good Frenching, while drunk at an after-work party, having mistaken her hat made of zinnias for Ron's shaggy red hair. Then again, 3 Christmases ago, when she'd confided that she'd been planning on proposing to Ron at midnight on New Year's Eve with a rock the size of a snitch. And then tonight, the 7th of June, 2002, an unseasonably warm early summer evening that had lulled Harry into a postprandial doze as he lounged in his armchair, a copy of More Than Just the Broad Strokes, Secrets of the Old Magical Masters, sitting open in his lap. Painting was the sort of thing, as he understood it, that you couldn't really be bad at, but that didn't mean you were automatically good at it either, and if he was going to be selling his pieces, even for charity, he kind of wanted people paying for them because they actually admired his work and not because he was him. He was awoken from the aforementioned postprandial doze by a staccato rapping on his front door, jolting him back to consciousness. He blinked a bit blearily and tried to put his thoughts in order, because there were all of about 3 people who had any business being behind that knocking, and none of them had intimated any plans to drop by any time soon. The rapping was loud and insistent, though, and Harry quickly laid aside More Than Just the Broad Strokes, one hand ruffling his hair into a state that didn't look fresh from a nap, and the other reaching to slip his wand into his pocket, just in case. The property was warded 6 ways to Sunday, so this was either an impromptu visit from someone who wished him well, or a sneak attack from a very capable someone who didn't. Then again, very capable someone's not wishing him well generally wouldn't knock, he supposed, so he told his rusty, malformed trainee aura instincts to stand down, took a breath, and pressed down on the handle. "I took him," were the breathless first words that came tumbling out of Hermione's mouth, and there was very little room to wonder who him referred to. Her legs shook beneath the weight of the very unconscious, God, he hoped just unconscious, limp body of what looked like Draco fucking Malfoy, an arm slung over one of her shoulders as she struggled to support him. Harry rushed to her side, bracing a shoulder of his own to help her drag Malfoy over the threshold. "You took him?" "Stole him, really," she huffed, and from this angle Harry could see she was not entirely put together herself. Her bushy brown hair was matted with sweat, and the muscles in her neck were taut and strained. She'd been through something, and it wasn't over yet. "You stole him?" Harry shook his head. "Stole Draco Malfoy? From where?" Hermione looked like she wanted to dump Malfoy's body into the armchair Harry had just vacated, which was not happening. He instead began angling them toward the hallway, halfway down which was his study-turned-art studio. There was a sofa there they could enlarge into something suitable for Malfoy's lanky form, and more importantly, there was a door they could lock, so when Malfoy inevitably roused, assuming, again, that he was not dead, he wouldn't be able to get up to much mischief beyond spoiling one of Harry's fresh canvases. Hermione's lips, already thin, pressed into a pinched line, and her gaze went distant. Somewhere even he didn't deserve to be. Somewhere that'll want him back. Harry hadn't seen her this on edge since the war. Countless nights spent huddled in Perkins's tent, praying their wards held, wondering where Ron was, if he was trying to find them, if he'd been captured, if he was even still alive. The stress and worry had aged her in those months on the run. But the years since had been filled with enough happiness, or at least enough not terror, to bring back some of her girlish charm, and she even on occasion found the time to join her ministry co-workers for drinks after work. Hermione Granger, stepping out for a pint, getting drunk enough to mistake the Quibbler's editor-in-chief for her then fiancé, proposing not at midnight on New Year's Eve, but 2 hours later because she'd been so caught up in a date with Padma Patil on the medical applications of some exotic branch of magic Harry had never even heard of, that she'd simply forgotten to enact the grand plan she'd been working on since 8th year. So, yeah, it had been a minute, a few million minutes even, since he'd seen her so on guard, so racked and haggard, like she'd lived through a dozen more wizarding wars in the time since they'd last spoken. It was just their lives, his and Hermione's and Ron's, were almost boring these days. Hermione was working in the Office of Magical Justice with the DMLE, though how that had brought her into the orbit of a Death Eater who hadn't been seen in public in nearly 4 years was another question entirely. Ron was raking in galleons by the bucket load as one of the owners of the Wheezes Empire, with shops on 3 continents now, and a new one opening on a 4th this autumn. And Harry was retired. Sure, some might think being retired at the ripe old age of 21 was a bit absurd, but those folks had likely never lived through a war. 2, technically, if you counted the tail end of the first one. Died, come back to life, and struck down a Dark Lord. Harry reckoned he'd earned a bit of relaxation, all things considered. Oh, he'd tried to keep up appearances, and for a while there, at the beginning, it hadn't been appearances. He genuinely had wanted to go into Auror-ing. His life, from the moment he'd set foot in the wizarding world, had been defined by combat in some form or another, so it just felt right that he keep on at what he was reasonably good at, solving mysteries, rallying companions, and emerging victorious in battles of wand work. But he hadn't made it out of basic training before PTSD and issues with obeying authority had him being politely asked to withdraw his application. He'd been furious at first, furious and more than a little ashamed, but then a dozen drinks, a sobering charm, and a long conversation with his best friends had shown him that maybe scarlet robes didn't really suit him after all, and perhaps he ought to find something he actually wanted to do, not something everyone expected him to do. So he'd retired, because it was one of the few luxuries he could allow himself. The best thing he could think to do with his free time was whatever the hell he wanted, without worrying if it would make others happy or pay well enough to be worth the effort. He hired an accountant to let his money make money for him, and then bought a cozy little cottage hidden away in the countryside. His nearest neighbour was an old Muggle couple who owned the 300 acres he was technically squatting on, warded it to hell and back with Hermione's help, and quietly faded from public life. Boredom had been a phantom he'd battled on several occasions, and guilt yet another, but he'd learned that all it took to keep the dark thoughts at bay was a busy mind. In the years since retiring, he'd written a few reasonably successful Muggle children's books. He'd had a lot of time to fantasize as a child, under the pen name Dudley Vernon, and when Hogwarts was in session, he had a standing invitation from McGonagall to help the first years get their bearings upon a broom. The headmistress had tried repeatedly to convince Harry to join the staff full-time, if not the Defense Against the Dark Arts post, then at least as flying instructor, so Madame Hooch could finally retire herself. But he'd declined on every occasion, not quite wishing yet to give up his quiet life in the English countryside. The recent changing of the seasons had brought a shift in Harry's mood along with the warming temperature, and he'd taken up new hobbies of gardening — he was very bad at it — and painting. He was actually kind of good at it, enough so he was considering the aforementioned charity auction. It wasn't the sort of thing that was going to wind up in his eventual biography, he suspected, but he was quite all right with the last line of any book written about him being, "And he subsequently led a life of quiet solitude, unbothered and unheard of again." But then Hermione had shown up on his doorstep, a very probably dead Draco Malfoy in tow, and all hope of a snooze-fest of a biography flew right out the window. "He's not dead," Hermione said, only now producing her wand to levitate Malfoy the final few feet toward the studio sofa. "Not yet, though he might be, if they find him." "They," Harry said, tone flat, and he shook his head as he enlarged the sofa. "Are you going to tell me what the hell's going on?" She chewed on her lower lip, and Harry gave her the time it took to deposit Malfoy's unconscious form on the cushions to collect her thoughts. The enlarged sofa wasn't Harry's finest work. Malfoy was almost swallowed by the now oversized throw pillows that read "Namaste in bed" and "Embrace the chaos," but he was justifiably preoccupied at the moment. Harry inclined his head toward the sitting room, and Hermione nodded, following him from the studio and locking the door behind her, with 2 different spells, one to keep the occupant in, and another to keep would-be intruders out. She caught Harry frowning and gave a wincing smile. Just a precaution. You can't possibly imagine I'd hurt him. Oh, no, of course not. It's only in case... She gave a cursory look around the cottage, which was quickly managed, as there were all of 3 rooms in the whole place, and dropped her voice. I think we'll want tea. Harry thought he would be wanting something a hell of a lot stronger than tea, but he had to trust that Hermione, of all people, would have a good reason, or what she thought was a good reason, for showing up out of the blue, not even a Patronus to warn of her arrival, to dump a Death Eater in Harry's lap. He left her to her own devices while he put the kettle on, and out of the corner of his eye he caught her pacing around the sitting room, casting quietly under her breath what he gathered to be even more wards and security charms. Harry was struck by a wave of unwelcome memory. Apparating in the dead of night or grey of morning, weaving webs of jinxes and charms around their campsite to deter any passers-by from glancing too hard in their direction, praying the magic held up when snatchers wandered too close. Hermione didn't truck too much in paranoia these days. The wards she'd set up around Harry's property were largely to keep muggles away, and the unplottable nature of the location was simply for privacy's sake. This was real, genuine fear she was labouring under, and Harry wondered now if 2 different locking spells on the studio door was too lax. She graciously accepted her cup when Harry returned, waving away the offer of a plate of biscuits to go with it. He left them on the table between them. She'd want them eventually. Something to nibble on gave her an excuse to pause to gather her thoughts, and took a long, bracing sip, eyes closed. I haven't been entirely truthful, with you or Ron. Harry felt his stomach turn as a jolt of anxiety speared through him. They weren't the 3 peas in a pod they'd once been these days, but they were still them, still Harry and Ron and Hermione. And the thought that she might have had something important she hadn't felt she could share with them, well, it didn't fill Harry with warm and fluffy feelings. It's nothing bad, she hastened to add, perhaps seeing the maelstrom of emotion that had crossed Harry's features. Only we aren't allowed to tell. But now I really must, because... She swallowed, finally reaching for a biscuit, and fixed her watery brown eyes on Harry. I'm an unspeakable. Harry blinked, then opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. I thought... But the Office of Magical Justice... Hermione bit into the biscuit, nodding. It's a cover story, I'm sorry. I did start there for the first few months, but then I was sort of recruited. Well, I suppose recruited isn't really the right word. They didn't really give me much of a choice. That is to say, there's no way I could have turned them down. It was either join the Department of Mysteries or just never know. She wasn't making any sense at all, and where was Malfoy's involvement in all of this? That seemed like the most salient topic right about now. Had he been an unspeakable too? Was that where he'd been all these years? No, what? Oh, Harry, everything! You can't imagine what sorts of things they do down there. I mean, of course we got that little glimpse back in 5th year, but God, there's so much more. Everything esoteric, everything we think of as ineffable, incomprehensible, they actually study. They understand. It's all the knowledge in all the world just waiting behind a big black door. And when they said I could walk through it, that I could be part of it, I mean, was I supposed to say no? How could I? She sounded a bit manic, like she was trying to justify her own career choice to herself. And then they asked if I wanted to join the transmogrification team. Harry wasn't even going to pretend he knew what that was. I'm sorry, the what? She reached for another biscuit. The transmogrification team. It was to be part of the newly established Essence Room. We would focus on existence itself, our bodies, our souls, our thoughts and feelings, and how they're all intertwined. Our team specifically would deal with the human body and all the ways magic can and can't manipulate it. I mean, imagine, our approach to spellcraft when it comes to our bodies is so ill-refined. We can tweak the size of our nose or our hair colour with a glamour, but
We can't regrow limbs, not without a special potion and a long and painful process, and we're still entirely at the whim of nature when it comes to recovering from illness. We can snuff out a creature's life with a single word, but we can't destroy tiny viruses that ravage the body or eliminate rogue clumps of mutated cells that undo us from the inside out. So I thought... She took a breath, nibbling on her second biscuit. I thought I could finally make a real, tangible difference. I thought, this is what I meant to do. The Office of Magical Justice would leave me exposed to human whim, but the DOM... They're an entirely self-sufficient operation. I could make a difference there. She warmed her hands on her teacup. Hubris. As much mine as the department itself. Harry let her ramble, still not entirely following the conversation, but his patience was rapidly wearing thin, and he reached forward to place a hand on her knee when she seemed to have lost herself in private recollection. Hermione, please. What's this all got to do with Malfoy? Right. The transmogrification team. Word came down from someone higher ranked than we were, but that could have been nearly a dozen people. 006 loves to micromanage and has more ideas than sense, but I did hear word that 005 was hoping to get a project rolling that might see them promoted to 004's old position. And most of our team, most of us were just double-digit ranked, research personnel only. Who were we to question project guidelines? Anyway, word came down that we were to focus all of our research efforts on animagecraft. They loaded us down with an entire library's worth of old project files, and honestly, they made some fantastic strides. I practically lived at the Ministry for 3 weeks, told Ron I was going on a team-building retreat to Rome. I must have memorized every spreadsheet and abstract and poster presentation in those files that had anything remotely to do with the DOM's research on animagecraft, but... She swallowed. The more I read, the more I realized there were holes. Things missing from the material they'd given us. References and bibliographies that didn't seem to exist, or authors whose names had been completely wiped from the registry, so she bobbed her head. Me being me, I couldn't stomach the idea that there was more I wasn't allowed to see, and really, how did they expect us to put our best work forward if we didn't have access to all available utilities? It would have been wrong for me not to sneak down to the archives and do a bit of private research. Clearly, Hermione had not changed as much in the years since Hogwarts as Harry had imagined, and privately, he smiled to himself. And that's when I found him. Her voice went small and soft. Page 223, Volume 7 of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, detailing the life cycle of the Carpathian black blood, fitted with an undetectable extension charm that led to a cell where he was being held under stasis. She shrugged, half to herself, no longer looking at Harry, and gaze gone distant. I think they'd had him in there since the war. No one saw him after the final battle. I'm pretty sure everyone assumed his folks had sent him abroad so he couldn't be prosecuted. I know I never looked into it. She directed her attention back to Harry now, coming back to herself a bit. Did you know? Had you heard anything? Heard anything? About Malfoy? He shook his head. No, I guess I never gave it much thought. I think I knew they'd rounded up his dad, but I never... She nodded sadly at this. Me neither. But it was him. He was alive, is alive, but hidden, and no one could have possibly found him. I don't even know how I did, really. She rubbed at her eyes, and Harry noticed her teacup was empty. He twitched his wand, directing it to refill itself, and she offered him a grateful little smile. I read the file they kept on him, tucked into the index. It was extensive. He wasn't the only one they had locked up in the archives. He was part of a group of Death Eaters the Department of Mysteries had managed to get their hands on in the confusion that followed the end of the war. They'd been using them for pretty much any experiments deemed too cruel to use animals with. Harry felt his distaste for the Ministry, long dormant since Fudge had been its head, begin to rise again, burning like bile in his throat. But in one case, a researcher from the Arcana Room had developed a spell that could reveal what someone would turn into if they were to become an animagus. And on the surface, that seems like an incredibly useful spell, really. It could save someone the stress of going through the trouble of such a long and complicated process if they knew they might turn into a cockroach or a sloth or something. It had fantastic applications, so of course they tested it on the Death Eaters. And Malfoy's bad luck, or his parents' staggering foresight, the spell said he'd take the form of a dragon. Evidently the prospect of having him as a puppet was far too tantalizing for the department to turn down, so she grimaced. So they used the Imperious Curse to force him to go through the process. Fuck me. Harry's stomach dropped as his mind drifted back to his tutelage under Not Moody and the stomach-churning sensation of losing himself, control being snatched from him and struggling to wrest it back. But then the weight of Hermione's words finally slammed home. Wait, are you saying Malfoy, that Malfoy, the one sprawled out on my sofa, can turn into a dragon? Not can, she corrected. Has. He had to complete the Animagus spell. And it turns out that not a single soul in the entire Department of Mysteries paid attention in their Care of Magical Creatures class, or else they might have remembered that dragons are fantastically resilient against spells and other magical effects, meaning that as soon as Malfoy was forced to complete the transformation and assumed his new form, he was able to easily shrug off the Imperious Curse they'd placed on him, and was finally in control of himself once more. She sipped her tea primly. You can likely imagine how he reacted. Harry slumped back into his seat, world still tilted a bit on its axis at the notion the wizard laid up in his studio could probably swallow him whole if he so pleased. And Malfoy being Malfoy and Harry being Harry, he probably would please. I'm guessing it wasn't a strongly worded L to the minister's inbox? Not quite. In fact, it was all a bit too much for him. Between the trauma of being held under the Imperious Curse for so long and the rage he surely felt on finally being freed, combined with the dragon's raw animalistic instincts, well, he went a bit mad, berserk. Killed at least 20 unspeakables before they finally managed to force him back into his human form through sheer overwhelming magical power. Except mad, berserk. And she'd brought him to Harry's doorstep? Except, Harry repeated faintly, except it's dangerous forcing an animagus out of transformation, especially a new one who hasn't entirely gotten control of their new instincts, or rather who's let those instincts run wild. In Malfoy's case, they made him turn back, sure, but it was just his physical form. His mind was still entirely that of a beast. A wounded animal, confused and frightened and bereft of any rhyme or reason. She swallowed. So they forced him into stasis until they could figure out how to control him, or else decide he was too much trouble and execute him. They put him under and threw him into a cell, locked within the pages of a book in a library no one knew existed. She stared down into a cup, reflection rippling over the liquid surface. And I couldn't just leave him there. Not once I realized what they'd been doing to him. I'm no more his fan than he was mine, and he deserved to answer for all the lives he ruined, either implicitly or explicitly. But this was beyond the pale, so I transmogrified him into a teacup, and that threw Harry. A teacup? It's all I've been able to manage so far. Transmogrification is terribly difficult. Wizards' innate magic complicates everything. She snatched up the entire biscuit tray. I turned him into a teacup, and I stole him. She said it now with conviction, a touch defensive, like she was standing before the Wisengamot accounting for her crime. Clearly, you could take the girl out of the Office of Magical Justice, but you couldn't take the Office of Magical Justice out of the girl. A beat passed as Harry processed everything she'd said and the situation in which Harry had inadvertently found himself through sheer proximity. Does anyone else know about this? That he's here? She shook her head, short and sharp. Ron doesn't even know I'm an unspeakable. It's gutted me not being able to tell him. I've come close so many times, but I didn't think it mattered. It was just a job. What difference did it make if I was working on level 2 or level 9? She pursed her lips. I'm going to tell him, though, tonight. It's not safe for him not to know now. Harry glanced back toward the studio door, with Malfoy slumbering just on the other side of it. Why did you bring him here? She flinched, and Harry hated that he thought just a little bit good. A small, selfish part of him resented her for this, for involving him in whatever nasty business the Department of Mysteries was dabbling in. Really, she ought to have known better. She'd been there with the rest of them. She'd seen what they studied, what dark corners of existence they strove to shine a light on. Topics better left ignored. But this was Hermione, and she'd never met a good mystery she didn't want to see solved, as ravenous for knowledge as any Ravenclaw. He shouldn't have been surprised to learn she'd become an unspeakable. He wasn't, in fact. I was hoping you might look after him. He won't bother you. I tried everything I could to get him to rouse, but he's practically dead. I'm sure it's some sort of curse I just don't know the counter to, but I can't hide him at mine and Ron's. That's the first place they'll look, for one, and Ron... Well, you know how Ron feels about Malfoy. Harry didn't point out she knew how he felt about Malfoy too, but that hadn't stopped her from trying to make him Harry's problem. Plus, your home's unplottable and warded to the teeth, and it won't be for forever, of course, just until I can figure out who's responsible for this. Despite it all, I really do believe this is the work of a rogue entity. A higher-up, probably. The single digits all tend to give each other wide berths, a sort of, you don't mess with my projects and I won't mess with yours approach. The DOM has quite a bit of latitude, but they aren't completely unaccountable. The Minister and the DMLA will put a stop to this, I know it. She fixed her gaze, hopeful now, on Harry. Please. I didn't know where else to go. He's helpless. She smiled tightly. And you have a thing for saving people. I stole him, she'd said. Not I rescued him, because he hadn't been rescued, only taken, moved. Freed from his physical bindings, but still mentally a prisoner. He shook his head. I don't like that you're doing this on your own. These people are dangerous. Surely there's something more I could be doing than... She leaned forward, a hand on his. This is what I need from you. Sanctuary and grace towards someone who very much doesn't deserve it. You're right, these people are dangerous, so I've got to be smart, and that means doing this on my own. Because, no offense, and I love you, but subtle you are not, Harry Potter. He opened his mouth to protest, but she cut him off. I'm not chasing justice on my own. I do have other friends, you know. Trusted confidants who may not know the whole story, but who'll still do me a good turn. Harry was still not convinced. You'll tell Ron? Straight away? Maybe you should both come stay up here. We can add on a room or get a tent like we used when we were hunting Horcruxes. Hermione shook her head sadly, though, standing. We can't. It'll raise a dozen alarm bells. I have to act like nothing's amiss. They'll find me eventually, but I can stall for as long as possible, and Ron will help, if he knows what's good for him. She pocketed the remaining few biscuits. Harry saw her to the door. What if he wakes up? He won't. But what if he does? Or if anything else happens? Her eyes darted back toward the hallway. Send Ron a Patronus with an innocuous message. He'll know you won't send one lightly, and he'll make sure I hear. I'll contact you back as soon as I can. She paused, seeming to consider her words, then launched herself at him, wrapping him in a fierce hug. Thank you, she whispered tightly. I knew I could count on you. Well, like you said, I have a thing for saving people. She gave him a quick peck on the cheek. If nothing else, I'll check back in at the weekend, all right? Surely you two can't get up to too much mischief between now and then. Get off my property, Harry said, shutting the door behind her to force her onto the porch, though he didn't close it all the way. Be careful. She nodded, smiling gratefully, and then turned on her heel and was gone with a sharp crack. And suddenly it was just Harry, the too warm June evening, and an unconscious Draco Malfoy, all alone in his tiny little cottage. He shuffled his way back to the studio, unlocking the door and slipping inside. Malfoy was still out, just not even moving to show he was breathing, and Harry still wondered if Hermione hadn't got it wrong, and he was in fact very dead. If Harry's home started to smell because of this wanker's rotting corpse, they were going to have words. But the longer he looked, the more he saw the truth of what Hermione had said. His cheekbones were sharp enough to slice your finger on, and the thin shift he wore hung off him in all the wrong places, like there was next to no meat on him. His white blonde hair was lank and matted, far from the slicked-back coiffure he'd taken such pride in sporting years ago, and his skin had a chalky pastiness to it. Harry did not feel the same swell of pity as Hermione evidently had, seeing Malfoy brought low like this, but something did stir inside him, a coiling sense of unease. As bad as Malfoy looked on the outside, he was worse off on the inside. Maybe he was still locked in there, reliving the nightmare that had been his weeks of magical compulsion, over and over and over. Harry sometimes thought it was the worst of the unforgivables. The Cruciatus curse just hurt, and the killing curse just killed you. The Imperius curse, it took away your agency, made you a prisoner in your own body, forced you to watch as you did all sorts of things you didn't want to do, said things you didn't mean, hurt people you loved. It left the sorts of scars people couldn't see, and sometimes those were worse than the ones they could see. "Hermione'll get you sorted," he said, his conviction absolutely unfounded, but it was all he could manage just now. He pulled out his wand and tweaked the growth spell on the sofa, refining it into something a bit more bed-like, then summoned a throw from the cupboard and settled it over Malfoy's form, stopping just shy of tucking him in. It wasn't as if Malfoy would appreciate these little touches, but it made Harry feel a bit better himself, and he bent down to clap Malfoy on the shoulder, reminding him the toilet was at the end of the hall, and then locked the door behind him once more, retiring at last for the evening.